Is episode 600. Today, I have invited Becky Feasby back to the Slow Flower Show to talk about a project she is spearheading to evaluate the floral industry's relationship with invasive plant species, both growing and designing with problem plants that are harmful to the environment, to local economies, and to the larger community. This past December, Becky convened an invasive species roundtable to discuss and determine best practices around this topic. The expert panel included Doug Tallamy, professor of entomology and wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware, Latifa Pelletier-Ahmed, a botanist and native plant expert with the ACLA Native Plants Society in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and Nicola Dixon, State Priority Weeds Coordinator for Australia's Department of Primary Industries. Those invited as educators and floral industry participants included florists and growers who are both part of the Sustainable Floristry Network and the Slow Flower Society members. I was so happy to join the session, and I learned so much from the discussion. I learned that even the best of intentions from those of us who think our practices are good for the planet can yield damaging results. As an outcome from that session, Becky worked with Rita Feldman, founder of the Sustainable Floristry Network, to produce a report that introduces the topic of invasive plants to florists, farmers, and wholesale sellers. She shared a preview of that report with me, as well as several lists of dirty dozen plants found in the floral marketplace in the US, Canada, UK, Europe, and Australia markets, drawing input from some of the roundtable experts. It's such a timely topic, and if you follow Becky's Instagram feed, Prairie Girl Flowers, you've already read some of her posts about invasive species in the floral trade. I asked Becky to join me today to share about her research and to help us understand what each of us can be doing to eradicate invasives from our own design work, farms, and gardens. Let's jump right in and meet Becky Feasby, and I'll thank our sponsors after the interview. Well, hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Slow Flower Show with Deborah Prinzing. I'm delighted to welcome back my good friend and past guest of this show, Becky Feasby of Prairie Girl Flowers. Hi, Becky.
Hi, Deborah. Nice to see your face.
Last time we recorded, we were sitting in your little kitchen nook.
That's right.
Sharing the bench with your two large dogs, and it was.
I have one dog at my feet, so.
Okay, I thought you were going to wear them out so they could nap.
I did. I did.
Okay. Well, I really try not to overshare certain guests, but when there's something new and important to share and bring to the community, I have to just grab the opportunity. So, we'll share links to past episodes with Prairie Girl Flowers so that people can get your whole life history. But right now, I want to just bring people up to speed about this new initiative, I guess, educational advocacy project around invasive species in the floral industry. And can you talk a little bit about, how that became part of the Sustainability Sunday series, and how did this bubble up to be kind of top of mind for you and in your research?
Sure. It's funny. It was actually the very first post I did for Sustainability Sunday was on invasive species. So it is, when you say top of mind, it
Wow.
literally was one of the first things that it's what I led with.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's largely my background is in horticulture, right? So
Right.
I'm familiar with sort of invasive species from an ecological perspective, landscape perspective, but I was really surprised to see them being used in floristry. And so this kind of threw me off. I was like, wow, I can't believe these are being sold, being used, being designed with, being foraged for, all of the things. And so I thought this is an important piece that I think is maybe missing from a lot of educational, we do the no foam, we do the plastics, we do the bleach dyed, we do local, all those things. But what about this?
Is it because most of the invasive species that we're going to discuss kind of fall into that foraged category? Like they're not necessarily commercial
Well,
crops?
I think there's both for sure.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that are commercial that you see going through wholesalers. Still, like from the farmer or greenhouse or whatever it is through the wholesaler to the florist. And then there's that foraging aspect that is, a part of both flower farming and floristry, where
Mhm.
flower farmers might be like, hey, I've got all this great greenery, whatever it is on my property, I can cut and sell that as well, which is a completely understandable impulse.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
it has a good vase life, if it's pretty, any number of things, why wouldn't you profit from that? I mean, that
Yeah.
is completely legitimate thing to want to do.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
but getting the
yeah,
right information is pretty much the gray area,
yeah,
and also there are regional differences, but you're kind of going global with this and talking to people
yeah,
around the
yeah.
globe.
I am, and I think people there are for sure regional differences. What is invasive in Australia is not going to be invasive in England, for example,
Mhm.
because of huge geographical differences, climate differences, and so on, right? Um, but but I think there's value in sort of looking at it globally and not making the regions too small, because I think in for me, in my opinion, I would rather cast the net too wide than too small.
Yeah.
Simply because I think it can be tricky to say, oh, you can harvest this species, for example, in California, but not in Oregon,
Right. And
or
and
vice
um
versa. Because there's going to be some creep there with climate change, with movement of people and plants. There's going to be creep.
and let's just admit that, like, spores and birds carrying seeds don't really respect state or country
No,
boundaries. It's sort of a
no, and
artificial thing.
yes, it's funny. I was chatting with Rita Feldman of the Sustainable Forestry Network about that exact thing, saying, when we look at the government websites of information and other things, it sort of be like, well, this is invasive in, where I am from Canada, in Alberta, but not in Saskatchewan. And I'm like, there's not a wall between Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
So how are we? How does that work, right? I mean, these
Right.
borders are not actually enclosed borders, and so I think, again, like I said, I would rather see florists and flower farmers adopt a sort of, a zero tolerance. Like it's like,
Mhm.
no, we are not going to use any of these, and we are going to find alternatives.
Yeah, and we're gonna err on the side of finding the alternative, which is aesthetically probably a completely perfect substitute. It's
Totally,
just
yeah.
getting out of the habit that we're in.
Yes,
Um,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
The one that came to mind the most, having lived in California, Oregon, and Washington, is the pampas grass. And
Yes,
I mean,
yeah,
if you go on vacation in the San Juan Islands, you will see that pampas grass from a few ornamental gardens has, like, gotten loose and has taken over the wild places of, especially, I see it on Lopez Island. And you know it's
yeah.
obviously winter hardy up there. It's not just a California thing.
Absolutely, and Pampas is a great example of, I would say, what I would consider a global species of concern. It's
Mm-hmm.
banned in places like Australia, but it can live in lots of, like, it's a fairly adaptable plant. It
Mm.
also, in each of those seed heads, if you've ever held a stem of it, there are so many seeds in one stem. It's also become very sort of fashionable in the floral industry,
It has. Yeah.
at least in response, in some part, in a response to trying to do better things, like trying to find things that do well out of water, that you don't have to stick and foam, that can be used in installations, and so on. But it's sort of taken off in this,
Yeah.
crazy way, where now we're seeing it dyed, we're seeing it shipped all over. We're seeing businesses that only, for florists, only sell pampas grass.
I mean, it's like a giant dandelion, right? When you talk about
Yes,
all the
it
seeds,
is. Yes,
just
yeah,
wave it around and you produce more than you could ever imagine.
yeah,
Yeah. Wow. Well, when did you actually start Sustainability Sunday on your Prairie Girl Flowers Instagram
yeah.
account?
Was it? I
A
feel like
couple
it was
years ago?
2020.
Okay.
Like, I think it was like October, November of 2020. It was sort of a pandemic thing for me, thinking, how am I gonna, create some sort of schedule, like weekly routine for myself, where I'm looking into things and thinking about them more and all of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And the work you'd done with sustainable floristry predates that, because you had your first sustainable flowers workshop up in Calgary, I believe in
Yeah.
2019, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And so this has sort of became a just a natural extension of educating people about sustainable floristry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So now we've talked about this before when
Mhm.
we recorded last May, but you are getting your master's in
I am.
sustainability at Harvard. Go
I am. Yeah.
Crimson. That's so
Yes,
cool.
right. Yeah.
No one would know that, but my husband went to Harvard, so I have to,
Yes.
like give them a shout out.
Yes.
Um, uh, that program has, I mean, you're the first person out of the floral space who's ever been in that program, as far as I understand, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and
Wow.
even ornamental horticulture, there's been, a bunch of people go through the program. That the program's been around since 2000, or so. That, through agriculture, and obviously there's, finance, like you name it, fashion, people from all different, industries. But oddly enough, I'm the first one from ornamental horticulture or floristry. So,
Wow.
so it's even been a surprise to my professors and colleagues and peers in the program that are sort of like, geez, I've never thought about flowers.
That's,
I
well,
mean, you
better,
must hear that all the time too.
yeah, better late than never. I mean, you're
Yeah.
going to, hopefully others will follow you into this, body of
Mhm.
research and kind of see that, the more informed we are about these sort of just the cause and effect of everything we do, then,
Yeah.
we can run our businesses more, I guess, with more, I don't know, consciousness and more
Yeah.
intelligence. Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of that, like, integrity piece that
Mhm.
sometimes is missing, for lots of us across lots of industries. I mean, I
Yeah.
always like to sort of make that clear too, that the problems that I bring up or the issues or ideas, they're not unique to the floral industry. They're across everything that we're
Yeah.
dealing with these
Yeah.
days, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
And now, yeah, and now at the very last moment before we destroy the planet, we're starting to figure out what can we do to reverse the
Yeah,
tide. I know
yeah.
that's hyperbole, but, that's
Well,
sometimes
I
it feels
mean,
that way.
I think I go back and forth between feeling like it is hyperbole and feeling like, "Oh, crap," like, you know, we gotta get going.
Well, in the course of your, research and also being part of the Canadian ambassador to the
Mhm.
Sustainable Forestry Network, this more recent project on invasive species took a little bit more structure and form rather than simply something that you posted on Sustainability Sunday, and you
Yeah.
hosted this private roundtable.
I wanted to convene a group of florists, flower farmers, researchers that were sort of interested in this as either a problem or an obstacle or something in their work, and then get some experts on board,
Mhm.
because understanding invasive species, it's quite a sort of nuanced, layered issue and idea for lots of people. And a little bit because it's sort of complicated sometimes to wrap your head around what constitutes an invasive species. The language can be quite daunting if you look at it online. The inconsistencies across websites or government documents or whatever. So it can be sort of this thing where you're like, well, forget it. Like, why
Yeah.
bother? So I
Yeah.
wanted to try to come up with something, create a place where we could come together and sort of discuss this. So we had Dr. Doug Tallamy, who's an ecologist and an invasive species expert from the US, from the University of Delaware, a botanist here in Calgary, Latifa Pelletier-Ahmed, who's a friend of mine and also a native plant expert. So she runs our Native Plant Society here. And then Rita Feldman of the Sustainable Forestry Network got us Nicola from Australia, who's their sort of weeds expert. I mean, again, the language, right, globally changes. In Australia, typically referred to as weeds. Here in North America, we would say invasive species. In the UK and Europe, sometimes it's alien
Oh,
species.
interesting.
Yeah,
So the
so
vernacular is not
yes.
consistent. Yeah.
No, it's not. Yeah.
And so when and I'm sorry, I forget a little bit how that was structured.
Yeah.
You kind of asked each of the experts to address a few questions, and I
Yep.
feel like, was it Dr. Talame who actually defined for us what invasive species means?
Yes, I think he did.
Okay.
He did at the beginning and sort of talked about, the sort of because it really boils down to sort of ecological and economic implications, right? So invasive species can spread into, let's say, farmland, so that a farmer's cattle are unable to graze in that area because the invasive species spread so quickly and they're poisonous to cattle. So that would
Mm,
be an economic
mhm.
issue or outcome of this happening. And then you look at all of the ecological issues. So that can be a decrease in biodiversity, which, most of us are starting to get familiar with that term biodiversity and understanding that it's important for
Yeah.
sustaining life healthy life on the planet. It can be reduced ecosystem services. So things that we benefit from the environment, whether that's food, clean air, water, the simple act of photosynthesis, all of these things. So invasive species can disrupt all of those things in the time that we're living in now.
Yeah.
Right. And
Right.
I often think that's a piece that's sort of missing, is that we're looking at what's causing a problem right now. Right. And so understanding that could change 50 years from now or 100 years from now. But
Mhm.
right now, what are our species of concern?
Is that in part because of climate change and that species are thriving in climates in which they previously would not have been able to survive
Yeah,
because of
I
the
mean, I
temperature?
think that recognizing that this era, the Anthropocene era that we live in right now, is the era of massive climate change and huge industrialized activities and globalization. So we've also seen the impacts of people moving themselves and other things all over the world. So
Mm,
most of the things that we look at as invasive species were introduced either through trade, commerce, contaminated shipping containers, like any
right.
number of things, right?
So interesting. I mean, that kind of goes back to, what Amy Stewart wrote about in Flower Confidential that over whatever 15 years ago that
Yeah,
U.S. Customs inspectors in Miami are inspecting cut flowers coming in for pests and pests alone, and so
absolutely.
it's just this like single issue inspection. Who knows how many invasive species comes in boxes of plants, especially in soil-borne, weeds.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you look at, some, like the emerald ash borer beetle, right? Like that we know is, wrecking ash trees, certainly a huge problem here in Canada. And I'm pretty sure massive problems in the US as well. I mean, they've tracked that to probably coming in on pallets, right?
Mm.
So it was wood cut from infected ash trees that served as pallets and then got shipped with any number of things, right?
Yeah,
Into the
they're just
US.
like a vector for these pests.
Totally. Yeah.
Wow.
That's why
Well,
you bring your own firewood sometimes, like, if you're going camping. Do you know what I mean?
wow.
Like, you can't bring your own firewood because the provincial park or the state facility or whatever be like, "No, you can buy firewood from us." And you think that's a money grab, but it's 100% because of invasive species.
Oh my gosh, I never
That's
thought about
that's the
that.
only reason why.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah,
why if you go to a horticulture conference, um, even outside of your state or definitely for me in the US, if I go to some place in British Columbia, I have to get this documentation to bring plants home
absolutely.
with me.
Yes,
This
because it's you yeah, exactly, because you could be introducing something, weird.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
or bad or whatever, yeah.
so you had this session. It was about an hour and a half, and it was really interesting. Also, I think just to see, you know, the point of entry for your experts. Some
Mhm.
people are looking at, well, like in Australia, they're looking at an island nation, and like there's if it's once something arrives there, it's really hard to eradicate. And for a native plant expert, I guess she was looking at like what are the native plant alternatives to invasive species that are, I don't know, either commercial or cultivated. I don't know.
Yeah,
It seems to be. And
yeah,
Dr. Tallamy was talking just a lot about environmental issues and all of these sort of problems that can cause our waterways and our farmlands and
yeah.
tree life. And it's kind of, you're right. It's overwhelming and
It is overwhelming,
scary.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and you look at the behavior of some of these plants. I mean, anybody who's dealt with, let's say, or oriental bittersweet on their property, you'll see that it sort of strangles out other trees and girdles them. It's called, which is like a girdle that poor women were forced to wear, but
Yeah.
it
Chokes it out.
chokes them out, and you'll see that it will leave these horrible indentations on trees, and so you can see that choking out a tree, which then causes trees to fall, which depletes carbon stores. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, there's
Yeah.
all of these sort of negative effects, and so then I just come back to, well, what role do we have in the flower industry then, and
Right.
how can we be supportive? How can we ensure that our practices are good and not harmful.
Right. Right. And so how do you tackle that? You look at
Yeah.
the ways that invasive species might appear in the industry, and who's in that distribution chain who could maybe make a decision that's uh, different.
Yeah, and I mean, some of it'll require a bit of government lobbying, I think, as well,
Hmm.
because governments are ultimately who create the, rules and regulations,
Policies, yeah.
yeah, policies, all of that. But I mean, I also think, small business owners, including wholesalers, could stand up and say, "Hey, we're no longer bringing this product in,
Hmm.
and here's
Well,
why."
you
Right?
have yeah, and you have some real life examples of things that you've stumbled across
Mhm.
where that's not being done. And
Totally not being done.
and
Yeah.
I can you share even just kind of without naming names, like
Yeah.
how you
Yeah,
address that?
absolutely. Yeah, so I would say I think it was last year I saw that a Calgary florist was selling tansy. So tansy is that does it grow where you are?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's
So it
kind
has
of
a big
like it's like a little yellow button flower,
little
right?
yellow button, sort of, a collection of them at the top of the flower. It dries beautifully, has huge long roots. Anyways, an invasive species here in Canada, certainly in Alberta and BC, Saskatchewan, I believe as well. I'm not sure that if it's gotten out east yet. So, anyways, there was a local florist who was selling tansy and was so excited about this. So I messaged them privately and said, "Hey, yes, it's beautiful. It is invasive, and so you shouldn't be selling it."
Mhm.
And I just got sort of a like on the thing. And so when I, and
Which which
Deborah,
yeah, like that means
I'm like, well, that's
that's not
so
good enough.
no, it's not good enough for me anyways. And so I said, hey, if you'd like to have a conversation about this, I'm happy to sort of explain to you some of the issues about invasive species. But really and truly, you can't be selling it. And they said, thanks, we'll look into it. I thought, damn it. So then I said, well, where did you get it from? I thought that was
Mhm.
interesting. And so it was from a wholesaler in BC. So then I contacted that wholesaler too, and I just got crickets. So then I thought, okay, well, what can I do? Like, what can I do to sort of hit home, like that this matters, that this is important? And so I phoned the Alberta Invasive Species Council and reported it.
Yeah.
And so they went there and talked to the florist. And the florist was furious with me because she said, I just got my hand slapped. And I said, well, that's okay.
Yeah.
Like
They
that's
didn't put
okay.
you out of business. They didn't
Yeah,
fine
like
her.
you didn't get fined, and it's okay. And I wasn't sticking. She goes, well, you're so mad at me. I said, no, I'm not mad at you. I was trying to again. So it's sort of I think that we need to, with so many things, but certainly with invasive species, sort of take that, like if we can try to find a way to remove the ego from it and go like, wow, I didn't know this,
Mhm.
right? Like I didn't know this was a problem. And
Mhm.
now that I do, I'm not gonna do that again.
Well, I
Right.
think yeah, and I remember last summer I was at a floral workshop at the Cal Flowers conference down in
Mhm.
San Diego, and I was just participating in a kind of hand tie bouquet workshop, and I posted some photos, and you messaged me, and you're like, "That's tansy." Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. And was
But
it?
yes, and
Yeah,
I
okay, yeah,
actually there was someone in my class who is a wholesaler
yeah,
in Portland, Oregon, and I made a comment and he said, "You're absolutely right. We are not allowed to sell this in Oregon. The Oregon
right.
Invasive Species Council has forbidden us from
Mhm.
selling it." So then we started brainstorming like, well, what would be okay, it's not even a focal flower, and when I
No.
was looking through your Dirty Dozens list, none of them are focal flowers.
No, no,
They're just like
no, it's not
random
like roses or peonies or dahlias are a problem, right?
it's like random foliage and filler, and I don't
Mhm.
even like to use the
Totally.
word filler, and, so we started saying, well, yellow yarrow would be the perfect substitute,
Yellow
or
yarrow. I mean, you could do solidago in some places,
yes,
right? You could do, there is, and I think it's some variety of mums, like it's a little tiny button mum
yes.
that's
Oh,
yellow.
yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
you could find ways to get the same look.
Yeah, for
Like
sure.
3 Billy buttons, dude, 3
Yes.
stems of Crispidia, they're slightly bigger balls, but I mean, whatever, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
if you're wanting that hit of sort of intense yellow that might dry in place, you have options.
Yes, and I think that's maybe from a designer's point of view, that's the core message is, "You're creative, You're an
Yeah,
artist. Artists
yeah,
solve problems.
yeah.
So find a workaround, and
And you
maybe your
can
work will be more interesting because you're
totally.
going a little extra, taking a little extra step to replace something that you know is harmful.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to like a thought that I had earlier when I was thinking about meeting up with you today. And I thought, I'm sure somebody will be like, oh God, here she goes again. So I can't use foam. I can't use bleached or dyed stuff. I
You're
can't,
such a drag, Becky.
I'm such a drag. But and I get it. Like I
Yeah.
get that it feels like a lot. But then I think to myself what it feels like when I go to the grocery store now, what it feels like when I make any kind of purchasing decision in my life. And I think so many of us are now thinking through things in different ways, right? When we go to the grocery store, we're looking at where the produce has come from. We're looking at, are we buying our peanut butter in a plastic container? Or are we buying it in a glass jar now? Are we
Mhm.
going to bulk places? Like, are we thinking through how much plastic or how much whatever it is that we're consuming? And I think for a lot of people, the answer is yes. They're making steps. And it stinks. Like it sucks to have to lose that sort of feeling of just being able to be like, oh, it's all good. It's
Yeah.
fine, right?
Yeah.
it's all good.
Yeah.
But
It's more
sadly, we're
thought.
at a point
Takes
where
more
it's not
thought.
all good,
Yeah.
right? And so I don't think, I don't even think it's sort of, I think we have to start thinking this way. I think we
Yeah.
have to force ourselves to get uncomfortable and make some of these difficult decisions for the sake of the planet.
I agree completely. I mean, not to, jump there, but, just watching the news about that horrible train wreck in Ohio with all the toxins and what
Exactly.
there will be implications for generations because
Of
of
course.
that.
Yeah,
And it's quite, it's quite unfathomable, really,
it is. Yeah.
um, that could happen, up in our country and in
Yeah.
our, on our continent. And, yeah. So with that kind of in mind, I do think that there's this sense that, um, if it's so overwhelming, we can't like go on a, go cold turkey all the time, like on
No.
everything. But
Right.
I think reducing invasive species use or eliminating it is actually one of the easier things to do
It has
because
to be. Like, I
yeah,
think because we're getting it does. Like you said, I'm working on these dirty dozen lists and when I release them and come up with them, I'm sure I'll get flack for them because I'm like, oh well, you missed this, 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 and this. I'm like, yes, they are not exhaustive lists, but
we're going to start here.
I'm gonna try. I'm starting with a dozen. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm going to let people know what the range of those species is. So when I do a dirty dozen list for the US, it will have the ranges. But right, so like Oriental bittersweet, I think is invasive in 30 states.
Okay. So range by geography.
Yes, so
Okay.
like so right now it's not classified as invasive here, here, and here, but it is all of here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So to let people know that there is that sort of regional difference, but then to also sort of go, okay, so again, I live one state over from Kentucky.
Right. Right.
Should I still use it?
Yeah.
Right.
That's a
And
real, yeah.
and and so I know I've had a lot of pressure from people saying, please make these hyper regional, like really. And I'm like, no,
You
I'm not going
can't.
to do that
You can't.
because I feel like I worry that that's going to give people permission to use something that is very soon going to be invasive where they are.
Right.
And can
And
you just do without it? Could you just not use Oriental bittersweet? Could you just not use tansy? Could you just not use autumn olive? Just take them out of your toolkit. Just
right.
remove them,
Right.
right?
And I think, when we look at some of the incredible, information sharing that other people have done, like, I know Sue McCleary has put on this list on her Instagram about the hardworking plants that you can design out of water and they'll last a long time out of
Absolutely.
water. We're
Exactly.
going to start seeing people creating these lists, especially for their region, of if you can't, you shouldn't use this, but here's a substitute. And I think that
Exactly. Exactly.
that's empowering. And
Well, I think it's
honestly,
helpful, right? Like
you
it does make it easier.
yeah, and every state has an invasive species
Yep.
kind of agency or office that probably has published a list,
Yep.
and that's not for you to always look up, Becky. We can do our own work,
Well, and I yeah, and I will be providing links to these things, right? And there's
Okay.
some great interactive maps too, right? That you can type in and then it will pop up with this map and saying like, look, here's where we have reported sightings of this.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. It's amazing. So if you have something like that, I mean, it's one thing if it's a cut and it's in an arrangement. There's probably a disposal recommendation for how to dispose of it. If it's
Yeah.
in your garden, there's probably another. So what
Yeah.
advice do you have for people who are going, oh, okay, I'm gonna eliminate this from my yard or my farm?
Yeah, if you're going to eliminate from your yard, I think you need to first look at what the plant is, because it's, again, not, there's not sort of a universal,
Okay.
approach. It depends on how that plant spreads or propagates itself. It depends, if some plants you can prune and it really helps, kill them off. Others you prune and it signals to them
Stimulates growth. Yeah.
go,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it depends. I mean, there are recommendations for some plants that, and you heard this from Professor Ptolemy, that you would cut off and then paint glyphosate or Roundup on that remaining stump to kill it right down.
Straight down into the root.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
again, not spraying it, taking a paintbrush and painting it on that exposed part. So there's those ways to do it. Some other plants, you can sort of successfully dig up and get
Yeah.
rid of. I would say never putting them in your home compost, because you're just not going to probably generate the heat required to kill the seeds or the root parts or whatever. Again, it's a bit of a plant specific thing. Is incineration enough? Like if you burn it, is that enough? For some, that's not. Some love fire, right? Like we know
Yeah.
that when we see forest fires, that some plants really regenerate amazingly well from that. So my recommendation in the stuff, the documents I'm coming up with, is to double bag it in plastic and throw it in the landfill, sadly.
Yeah.
Which
Well,
then people will say, well, now you're recommending people to send stuff to the landfill. And I'm like, well, not if you don't use invasive species.
yeah, but that advice is what people give about diseased rose foliage for sure. You don't ever put
Exactly.
that in the compost. You don't want it
Exactly.
to
And so I think it's,
spread that way.
yeah. So I think, again, that would require people to sort of look up where they live, what the local recommendations are. A lot of the various universities, extension schools, Cornell Extension. I saw a great article at University of New Hampshire. A bunch of our universities here in Canada have, like, here are ways you can dispose of them. But again, there'll be that caveat, not, this doesn't work for every species, right?
Yeah. So just
So
if you're
to just give florists or flower farmers one thing to do, I would say send it to the landfill.
right, but I also think do your own homework
Absolutely do your own homework.
and get
And get an
creative.
app, right? Like get an app on your phone. iNaturalist is a really good one. You can see what you've got. It'll tell
Really?
you what that is. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So from this session that you had in December, which I was very, very excited to be part of, and I learned a lot. You and maybe some of the other folks have started to build this sort of white paper or this information sheet that you're going to publish soon. Not quite yet, but we'll share it when it's available. And is that just sort of to introduce the topic to the floral trade?
Yeah, it's to introduce the topic, and it's something that I've worked on with Rita Feldman of the Sustainable Floristry Network, because not using invasive species aligns with the sort of guiding principles that the Sustainable Floristry Network has set out. So I've worked on that with her. And yeah, I think that she's going to probably develop something that's a bit more specific to Australia, because I mean, that's where she lives and she's more familiar with that.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of focusing on North America and UK and Europe. So not, I mean, I haven't touched South America yet and all of that, but, at least introducing people to understanding what invasive species are, what that term means, that it's not interchangeable with weeds. All invasive species are not necessarily weeds, and all weeds that we call weeds here in North America certainly aren't invasive species. Like the dandelion is not an invasive species.
Mm-hmm. Really
right?
good point. Yeah. So at least, I mean, no disrespect to Australia, but at least we're saying invasive species. And maybe with Rita's work, she's going to start being more intentional about defining the difference between.
Oh, and she is. And I think that
Yeah.
she might even be leaving some of it as invasive species. I mean, the governing body there is called Weeds Australia. So, I mean, it's so it's, and in the UK, a lot of it is non-native or alien.
Yeah.
It's sort of
so
interesting, right? So, yeah.
That is cool. Well, I am going to have Rita as a guest actually next week. So this is a nice segue. I know that, she's got a lot more to talk about. So I'm glad we're touching on this now.
Yeah.
And, this Becky, this has been super helpful for me to hear about. And I did tell you at the beginning of before we started recording, that I was going to like fess up to probably having an invasive plant in my garden. And I'm going to just tell everyone that it's a variegated form of porcelain berry vine,
Mhm.
which a lot of people love the porcelain berries because they're kind of this
The
brilliant,
like
luminous
unicorn
purple,
berries. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
purple turquoise color.
Yeah.
But you, when I mentioned it to you, you weren't sure if I need to, um, I just need to do some more research, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, some of the cultivars and stuff end up being sterile, for example.
I think that might be
Um,
my case, but I need to verify that.
yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah, exactly. But I think it's like so many things for us right now in the world of flowers is that sort of awareness piece and education building. I think if we can sort of look at that as empowering us and helping us and supporting us rather than feeling daunting, it will help
yeah,
us move forward, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in your document that you shared with me, you basically identified that invasive species appear in the floral industry, via wholesalers
Yeah.
who sell the plant because it is not officially banned from sale. It might actually be banned from sale as well, if we
Totally. And
use that.
a lot of those restrictions are like they're sort of voluntary things that you sign up to adhere to whatever it is, right? And
Interesting,
there's
yeah.
certainly not invasive species people running around to every floral wholesaler inspecting them every day to see if they are selling invasive species.
Right. And it's a cut, it's not a plant, so it might be
Totally.
treated differently by those inspectors.
Yeah.
And then florists who handpick or forage for the variety, which we talked about. And then when a plant is moved from an area where it is appropriate to a region where it is invasive,
That's right.
very interesting. And I do think that you point out, that thanks to social media, we see lots of beautiful images of things, and we think, how can I get my hands on this
Oh,
without
totally, because we're
doing?
looking for the next best thing, right? Which
Yeah,
again is a completely understandable way to feel because, florists, flower farmers, everybody and wholesalers, they're working hard and trying to stay afloat. And so they're thinking if I can differentiate myself somehow, this will help me, which is true, but it just shouldn't be in this way.
so this whole conversation follows an episode I had a couple weeks ago with Alex Kacheri of Sealy Farm. And
Mhm.
I told you about her. She's
Yeah,
involved in the Michigan Flower Growers Collective or Cooperative, and she sought out grant money to trial native plants for cut flowers. And the
yeah,
more I
huge.
think about, these are like two sides
Yeah.
of the same coin.
Oh, for sure.
We don't want to have invasives take over our farms and fields and wild places, but native plants are back to hyper regional. They're the ones that are good for our environment
They tend to be
and our
very good
pollinators.
pollinators, and they
Yeah,
tend to be, good for, preventing things like erosion and all these other things, right, that we're concerned about, and increasing biodiversity. So, I mean, and I've read some articles too saying, do we need to rethink a bunch of stuff in the floral industry so that we are moving away from these sort of traditional cut flowers, roses, hypericum, gerbera, alstroemeria, whatever, to look at regionally appropriate plants,
right,
many
right,
of which might be perennial, which
right,
again hold that root mass stays in the soil and so on. So I think, you're exactly right. When we talk about invasives, that can then turn into a much more sort of optimistic conversation about like, well, what other great things could I be doing or growing?
right, right. And how can I, if I'm looking for the new all the time,
Yep.
maybe
Yeah,
that's the first place you should start, is join your Native Plant Society and see what they have.
absolutely.
I know here in Washington, especially in the Seattle area, a lot of the plants that are sold at the Native Plant Society, spring plant sale or fall plant sale, they're things that aren't in general nursery commercial, on the trays or on the tables. You just don't see them. So you've got to start with the native plant experts who they're pretty jazzed about these plants, and they don't
Oh,
know
yeah,
whether they're good as cuts or not. So we should be experimenting with that.
absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. Well, anything else that I didn't ask you that you want to make sure we touch on today?
I don't think so. I mean, yeah, if people sort of pay attention to my Instagram, I will be getting those documents out. I'm going to be super happy to sort of share the bulk of the stuff that I come up with, free of charge and all of that sort of thing, just to get that information out there. And, always happy to hear from people that say, hey, like, you missed this plant, but it's a huge problem where I live. And then, great.
Yeah.
Let's
And
do
then
this.
I really I want to see somebody start this, like, not this, but that list,
Yes.
because that's really, a, a designer's, best toolbox is to figure out versatility in, how that, whatever that effect is you want. Do you want line? Do you want mass? Do you want focal? Do
Yeah,
you want texture? Find the alternative that will help you as an
absolutely.
artist, a floral
That's right.
artist.
That's right.
And
And so
then,
I think that will be my next step. And I'll likely collaborate with some other people on that to sort of say, okay, if this is our dirty dozen plus some honorable mentions, then what can we show people that are great alternatives?
I
And then
love
that
that.
that can be great supports for flower farmers to say, hey, I've started growing, X, Y, or Z that is going to be a really good substitute for this, for autumn olive, for example, which is
Right.
a huge problem. So
Right.
um,
Right.
yeah,
Oh, good. Well, let's just keep the conversation going, but this is a good way to
absolutely.
get started,
Yep.
especially now because, we've been in our dormant phase in most of
Yep.
our listeners, at least if they're here in the North American area. And now we're going to start observing our gardens again and, finding best practices
Yes.
and, even seeing what's showing up at the nurseries. I did think that, or at the garden centers or wholesalers, I think you had another interesting, uh, example that you shared with me before we wrap up, where you said there's a wholesaler that has in Canada that has, like, mixed ornamental grasses, like it's not
Yeah.
defined, and so you don't
No, and it's
know.
and it's coming in from a flower farmer, and so it's like, hey, there's this great like bucket o' grass, and so that's great, and I could see the design appeal of that, but I do think that we owe it to the industry to sort of know what's in there,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
and
Um,
proper
as
labeling.
appealing as it is to just go like, oh, all this airy, beautiful stuff, I can totally use that when I'm designing a table meadow for this wedding this weekend. That's perfect. But if it sheds a bunch of seeds and do you know what I mean? There would be easy substitutions for that.
Yeah, and if we have a consciousness about the decisions we make, then we're able to, I think it's empowering. We're not the
Yeah,
victims anymore. We're actually driving the conversation with our clients, our customers, and, the people we buy from and sell to. So,
totally. And I mean, I think that it can end up it, it can benefit us in ways that maybe we haven't thought of before, right? Like it is sort of an act of self-love to sort of care for the planet, right? It's not
yes.
it's not it's not entirely altruistic. Like there's
Yes.
we benefit from this too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no other reason than we have armies of volunteers here in Seattle going through all the city parks. It's with this organization called Ivy Out, and they're just
Yeah.
ripping English ivy from all these majestic trees because they want to save the parks, and
Yes.
they
Yep.
don't want to have the ivy eventually, choke out that tree. So,
That's right.
you
That's
know,
right. Yeah.
that is the act of self-love for where we live.
Yeah.
Becky, this has been so great. I know we'll have you back, especially when you get a little further along on your master's thesis.
Sure. Yeah.
No pressure, but how's that?
And we can get really down in the weeds, so to speak.
What's the timeline on that? Do you think the next full year you'll be working on that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Definitely for a year. Haven't started my research yet, so just waiting to finalize thesis proposal and all of that stuff, and then some field research, and then certainly lots of writing and research
And
and
number
statistics
crunching.
and numbers. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you save 2 days to come speak at the Slow Flower Summit
Oh,
in June
absolutely. Yeah.
about sustainability, and I'm just delighted that you're going to be there as a speaker and sharing your knowledge,
Oh,
and
me
people
too.
can
Well,
meet you
thanks,
in
Deb.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
well, thank you so much. This has been really
Thank
awesome.
you.
Thanks so much for joining us today. You'll find the replay of this video and more resources that Becky and I discussed in the show notes for episode 600 at slowflowerspodcast.com. As she mentioned, the fact sheet and the Dirty Dozen lists will soon be available via Prairie Grow Flowers on Instagram, and we'll be sure to share those. We'll be sure to share those links when that happens. Let's thank our sponsors whose financial support brings the Slow Flowers Show to you. This show is brought to you by slowflowers.com, the free online directory to more than 850 florists, shops, and studios who design with local, seasonal, and sustainable flowers, and to the farms that grow those blooms. It's the conscious choice for buying and sending flowers. And thank you to our lead sponsor, Farm Grow Flowers. Farm Grow Flowers delivers iconic burlap wrap bouquets and lush, abundant arrangements to customers across the U.S., supporting U.S. flower farms by purchasing more than $10 million of U.S. grown fresh and seasonal flowers and foliage annually. Discover more at farmgrowflowers.com. And thank you to Details Flowers Software, a platform specifically designed to help florists and designers do more and earn more. With an elegant and easy-to-use system, Details improves profitability, productivity, and organization for floral businesses of all shapes and sizes. You can grow your bottom line through professional proposals and confident pricing with Details all in one platform. All friends of the Slow Flowers Show will receive a 7-day free trial of Details Flowers software. Learn more at detailsflowers.com. Thank you to Cal Flowers, the leading floral trade association in California, providing valuable transportation and other benefits to flower growers and the entire floral supply chain in California and 48 other states. The association is a leader in bringing fresh cut flowers to the U.S. market and in promoting the benefits of flowers to new generations of American consumers. Learn more at cafgs.org. And thank you to Store It Cold, creators of the revolutionary CoolBot, a popular solution for flower farmers, studio florists, and farmer florists. Save thousands when you build your own walk-in cooler with the CoolBot system and an air conditioner. If you don't have time to build your own, they also have turnkey units available. Learn more at storeitcold.com. The Slow Flower Show is a member-supported endeavor, and I value our loyal members and supporters. If you're new to our weekly show or our long-running podcast, check out all of our resources at slowflowersociety.com. I'm Deborah Prinzing, producer and host of the Slow Flowers Show and the Slow Flowers podcast. Next week, you're invited to join me in putting more slow flowers on the table, one stem, one vase at a time. The content and opinions expressed here are either mine alone or those of my guests alone, independent of any podcast sponsor or other person, company, or organization. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I'll see you next week.